All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So over spring break, I looked over all of the peer reviews, and I gave you grades for your peer reviews and your draft papers based on your peer reviews. Like I told you before, I would not bring your grade down. So like if I thought that the person who peer reviewed you graded you too high, I would let that grade stand. And then I told the person who did the peer review, they got lower points because they didn't do a good peer review. If I thought your score was too low, I thought your peer reviewer was a little bit too harsh, I would bring your grade up a little bit, and I did that for a couple of people. But for the most part, the reviewers that actually assigned lower scores did a really good job. The majority of you as peer reviewers gave people much higher scores than I would have. So I saw people who literally turned in like a half a page and their peer reviewers gave them a 10 out of 10 on a 2-page paper, okay? They didn't necessarily point out the fact that your references were not in alphabetical order, which they should be. There is no, if you look at the guidelines, so I want to refresh everybody on what the guidelines are, because this is a really easy way for me to grade if you don't follow the guidelines of the paper. So these guidelines have been up since almost the beginning of the semester. And so you can access these. And as you can see, it says failure to follow all instructions will result in an automatic 0. Font size 11. Margin ½ an inch on each side. Single spaced. Must be 2 pages. Must not exceed 1,700 words. I can look, as I've graded literally hundreds of papers, I've written hundreds of papers, I can look at the papers and know right away that the font size is bigger than 11, that the margins are not half, that your spacing is more. Plus I've tried to do all those things to make page limits. So I know all the tricks. Okay, so don't do that, because I'm telling you right here, and you've known from the beginning, these are the instructions for how to set up your paper. And it also has, I don't know why I'm getting the pinwheel of death. That's fine. On that same thing, it lists all the subheadings. Those are the subheadings you need. I don't ask for an abstract. I don't ask for an introduction. I don't ask for a conclusion. Because that tells me that you don't understand your genetics enough. So you added extra information to try to make it 2 pages, but you couldn't write 2 pages on your topic. And I know you think 2 pages sounds like a lot. You'll have to do this exact same assignment when you take cell biology. You'll do it when you take microbiology. And it's at least double the size when you take evolution. So you have to write scientific papers, at least 4. And 3 of them are only 2 pages. So you're reading these people's papers that are, 10 or 12 pages, like in the journal format. When you have that all typed out, that's usually 30 to 40 pages. So you're reading hundreds of pages of people's work. You can summarize it into 2 pages. The other thing that I noticed that a lot of people were doing, and I commented on a lot of your draft papers, was plagiarizing. This link, again, has been here all semester. When you just copy and paste exactly what was in your source and you change like 2 words, that's plagiarism. Again, it shows me that you don't understand your topic. So for your draft paper, I let it go. I didn't take off any points. I'm not reporting people for plagiarism. But on your final version that's due on Friday, I will. Okay, so plagiarism is an automatic 0. You can read all of this for how to avoid plagiarism. And in case you have read that and it wasn't clear, I have another example for you. Oh, and no, that's why. Okay. So here are your subheadings, right? So these are the subheadings you need. You need to have references that need to follow the format in this link. So go to that link, no footnotes, right? References in alphabetical order at the end. So not following the instructions, I know you're like, well, who cares? It's just a stupid paper, like get over it. But when I submit grants, if I don't follow the instructions, they don't say, oh, well, that's cool. I mean, it's really good science, so we'll fund it anyway. They say, oh, she can't even follow instructions, trash. They call it triage. Triage means they throw it in the trash. So I'm not going to throw your paper in the trash, but that's what happens, even to me. My paper gets thrown in the trash if I don't follow the instructions. So it's really easy to follow the instructions. The hardest part should be writing the paper, not following the instructions for how to set it up. Okay, so go look at your references. And then if you have trouble with plagiarism, you don't know how to change things. This was the only example I could think of because I'm a pop culture nerd. I love music, and I grew up in the 80s and 90s. So I'm going to play you a little bit of 2 songs. Okay, I don't know if you can pick. Does anyone know what song is this? What song is this that I'm playing right now? It's Under Pressure by Queen and David Bowie. Very good. What song is this? Vanilla Ice. Ice Ice Baby. Right? I grew up in the 90s. What can I say? This was a very cool song when I was a kid. Those songs are the same. It's the same bass line. And now I'm going to play you one of my favorite interviews I've ever seen in my entire life.
Is this
It's Vanilla Ice. Yeah, it's Vanilla Ice. If you don't know who Vanilla Ice is or what he looks like, you're in for a treat. This is Vanilla Ice.
And just to prove his point, Vanilla breaks it down and sings the dings. Ding, 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 ding. Ding, 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 ding. Ding, ding, ding. That's the way theirs goes. Ours goes ding, 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 ding. Ding, 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 ding. That little bit change. It's not the same. Ours goes ding, 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 ding. Theirs goes. Ours goes. Little bit change. It's not the same. Not the same. Not the same. It's not the same.
Okay? This is what you're doing to me. I know that you've been listening to Queen and David Bowie because that is a cool song. And those are cool artists. And you're giving me Vanilla Ice and telling me it's different. And it is different because Vanilla Ice sucks. I don't want to read a sucky copied paper. Okay? It tells me that Vanilla Ice is not original. He heard this cool bass line on his brother's record, and he was like, yeah, that sounds cool. I'm going to add one more note, and it's totally different. It's not the same. Not the same. Right? And do you know what happened? He ended up having to pay them millions and millions of dollars, and poor Freddie Mercury and poor David Bowie actually have songwriting credit on Ice Ice Baby. It's really sad, right? You're like, oh. Okay. Another really classic example that's even better, and it's kind of what you're doing in your papers, is if you know the Tom Petty song, Won't Back Down, and the Sam Smith song, Stay With Me, the chorus is the same, but Sam Smith's is slower. So it doesn't quite sound the same unless you really know the songs. I really like Tom Petty, and I was like, wow, this Sam Smith song is really good. Why do I like this song so? Because it's hard. It's the same song, Tom Petty. Okay? So you're giving me the same paper, because you're changing just a little bit, you're changing the tempo or you're changing a note, okay? And that's plagiarism. And unfortunately, you can't go back and just say, oh, well, I'll just give them credit, it's okay, because you don't have millions of dollars to pay them. So you need to learn from these people. You can learn from the Beatles, you can learn from David Bowie, you can learn from Queen, but you need to write your own song. So you can learn from these people that you're reading their papers, but you have to write your own paper. And you can't get around it by quoting. We don't do that in scientific writing. We do not quote other people's papers. Okay, this is not a humanities class. So you need to take their words, think about what they're saying, and act like you're going to explain it to me. Don't read me their paper. Tell me you understand what that paper said, because you can explain it to me. Or you can explain it to your mom and dad. My mom teaches second grade, so she always smiles and nods, right? And my dad was a corrections officer, so he does the same thing. He tells me all the time, I read all your papers. Like, do you understand them, though? And he goes, sometimes. I'm like, yeah, that's good. Sometimes. He goes, I like it when I can understand them. I do, too. So if you have plagiarism, I think I've explained it the best I can. You have a link. You can go watch, it's not the same, it's not the same, it's not the same. It is the same, okay? But you can watch that over and over again if you want. But if you turn in a document that has plagiarism, I will report you to the university. And you will get a 0 on the assignment. Okay? So please don't do that. I don't like doing it. I've done it before. It sucks. It makes me feel bad. But I do it because it's not okay to plagiarize. So I think I've made that clear. If you have any questions about it, you can ask me. You can come to my office hours or shoot me an email. I'm not going to be able to read all of your papers because there are 88 people enrolled in this class, and I don't want to have to read the papers multiple times. Yes? You just got peer reviews. I did not read all of your papers. The only comments I put on people's papers were when I saw plagiarism, and I said, if you turn in a final draft that looks like this, I'm giving you a 0. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yep. No, it doesn't have to be completely different because I can see that I put it in as a revision assignment, and I can see what you've copied from. So look at your draft and see where it lit up. Change that.
I mean, like, if it's original in our rough draft, will we get...
I put it in as a revision paper, so it shouldn't. But if it does, that's why I literally go through and I check everything that lights up as plagiarism, and I see where you plagiarized from.
So
If
if it's from original paper.
it's from your original paper, I don't care, because it's your own writing. But if it's from a different source, yeah, then that's a problem. I believe it's 20%. You should be below 20%. But you can be below 20%, and I can still flag you for plagiarism if you have, like, some people had a good percentage, but they had an entire paragraph that was copied and pasted. So.
Do you want to keep the subheading, or you want transitions?
No, subheadings. Just like it's lined up in the thing. I don't need transitions. I don't need introduction or conclusion. Just the subheadings. That's all I want. Scientific writing is way different from like humanities writing where you're telling a cool story. In science, you're just telling the science. That's it. Yes? No footnotes. Nope. Use the link in the guidelines for how to set up your references. That's how the references need to be set up. And you don't need to put a header with your name on it or anything. I think I told you that earlier. I know your names because the system tells me who wrote each paper. So when you put that block of text that's like, oh, my name, my date, my name, the name of the assignment, I'm like, that's like 6 or 7 lines that you're, again, trying to make the paper longer. Don't do it. I don't need it. I know your names. Nope. No. Nope. You can if you want a title. I'll give you a title. But not like bigger, like 3 or 4 lines away. I know all the tricks. So if you want to put a little title, that's fine. And if it's like 1 and over 3/4, but not right at 2, that's fine. Like I'm not gonna, oh well, they could have written 2 more lines. Like I'm not gonna be like that. But if it's like a 1.5 pages, that's super noticeable. So those are gonna be due Friday. All right, spontaneous mutations. So we left off before spring break talking about this idea that mutations to DNA and the selective pressure that we experience because we are alive is what really drives evolution. Just mutation alone will not necessarily drive evolution. Mutation is the currency, right? We can't have evolution if we don't have mutation. But if a mutation is not favored or a mutation is not harmful, so it doesn't benefit you but it doesn't hurt you, there's really no reason for that mutation to have any effect at all. But if a mutation ends up being beneficial because of whatever selective pressure you're under, that will allow that mutation to persist in the population. So because I'm a microbiologist, I like to talk about bacteria because they're better than everything else. And one example of evolution in bacteria is evolution of antibiotic resistance. And sometimes people have this misconception that antibiotic resistance is a new thing. Like, oh, now we have antibiotics, so we have antibiotic resistance. But as long as there have been bacteria, there has been antibiotic resistance because antibiotics are simply compounds that one cell uses to fight another cell. So bacteria and fungi have been fighting each other for billions of years. And so the need to be resistant to these compounds has also been around for billions of years. But the idea of the increased prevalence of antibiotic resistance is because when bacteria replicate, and they replicate much more quickly than we do, they get to much higher numbers in the population than we do, they accumulate way more mutations than we do. If being antibiotic resistant is no benefit because there are no antibiotics, there's no reason to select for antibiotic resistance. So if you're a bacterium and you're just hanging out in the soil and you replicate and replicate and replicate, and one member of your population has a mutation that makes them resistant to tetracycline, is that mutation going to spread throughout the whole population? Usually no, because there's no pressure to be tetracycline resistant. Unless you are a tetracycline resistant bacterium found in the soil of any one of our agricultural fields, where the animals have been treated with a tetracycline derivative. Then tetracycline gets in the soil, and it becomes important to be tetracycline resistant. And so what will happen is everybody who's not tetracycline resistant will die, but that one mutant who is like, oh, cool, I'm tetracycline resistant, will be the one that's able to propagate and spread throughout the entire community. And that's what humans do with inappropriate use of antibiotics. The reason we have more antibiotic resistance is because we have overuse and misuse of antibiotics. So the 1 or 2 mutants that might have popped up in a population that were antibiotic resistant normally wouldn't have taken over and taken hold. But because we then start throwing antibiotics, we encourage them to become antibiotic resistant because we're telling them this is the only way you're going to survive. So in the absence of the selective pressure, the mutation really doesn't mean anything. So it's the combination of those two, a mutation and selective pressure, that promote the maintenance of mutations within a population. So it has to provide some sort of benefit. What's the downside of being antibiotic resistant? Oftentimes, bacteria that are antibiotic resistant grow more slowly than members of the same species who are not antibiotic resistant. So normally, it would be a detriment to be antibiotic resistant because you can't grow as fast. And when we're talking about your neighbor replicates in 15 minutes and you replicate in 20, that's a pretty big deal. But you throw those antibiotics on, and now you win. So you have to have that selective pressure. In humans, the example that we've talked about before is the trait for sickle cell anemia. If a person has sickle cell anemia, they'll probably die without treatment. If a person does not have sickle cell anemia, they'll probably get malaria instead, because we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, where both of these are really common. So why in the world do we see so many people who carry the sickle cell trait? Well, because they are resistant to malaria. So in the absence of that selective pressure, if people who carried the sickle cell trait had no evolutionary benefit, instead there was only harm because patients with sickle cell anemia died, we would see much lower frequencies of that trait in the population. So mutation plus selective pressure gives us evolution. And mutations can arise from a lot of different places. Replication is the first place. So I've told you numerous times that DNA replication is pretty good, but it's not perfect. Everybody makes mistakes, even your DNA polymerase. And your DNA polymerase is actually able to correct a lot of its own errors because of that phenomenon called proofreading. But it doesn't catch everything. And it really depends on the organism. It depends on the type of cell. But the mutation rate can be anywhere from like 3 in 10 million to 3 in a billion. Okay? 1 in a billion. It's very, very low. But when you think about that every time your cell replicates, it's accumulating more and more, you see why this eventually could cause a problem for the organism. So what will happen with replication errors is usually it's a simple substitution. It's a point mutation. One inappropriate base was inserted. And so when that happens, when the cell replicates, it will copy the wrong letter. So you get point mutations. And for the most part, a point mutation is probably going to be silent. It'll probably give you the same amino acid. Even if it gives you a different one, you may get one that's similar enough, so you might not have disruption. But every once in a while, you could get something really bad, like with sickle cell, where that single amino acid substitution leads to a dramatic change in the protein. But for the most part, not only are these errors not likely to lead to differences in the protein, these replication errors are not likely to occur in protein coding regions because the majority of our DNA doesn't even encode for proteins. So who cares if you like switch out a base in an intron? So that's why even though we do have errors and they do accumulate over the course of our lifetimes, the majority of individuals will not experience significant consequences from the acquisition of these mutations. A little bit more dangerous type of error that can occur during replication is called slippage. And in slippage, what can sometimes happen is that the template strand might form a little loop. And if that template strand forms a loop, nucleotides can be missed. So you can sometimes get insertions and deletions because of looping of template strands. And this is much more likely to happen in regions where you have repeats. So this slippage, this replication slippage, especially in repeat errors or in repeated regions, leads to errors in replication that give you things like Huntington disease and Fragile X. Because remember, Huntington disease is caused by repeats in a region of the Huntington gene. The more repeats you have, the more likely you are to develop Huntington. There's a cutoff. And in every generation, that cutoff, right, or the age of onset is earlier and earlier and earlier because of this replication slippage. You're going to accumulate more and more errors or more repeats in that region. And so you get earlier and earlier onset in successive generations. So that's when DNA polymerase makes a mistake. Again, not super common, but it does happen. Sometimes it can have significant consequences. But we are very fortunate in the fact that it usually doesn't. Other things that can happen are sometimes the bases just go a little wonky. So there are, for each base, there are two chemical forms. They can be amino or imino. They can be keto or enol. And when they start switching back and forth, you get inappropriate base pairing. And so they call them tautomers, the two forms, alternate chemical forms of the same nucleic acid. And when you have a shift, for example, if a base changes from the keto to the enol form, it may not bind appropriately anymore. So it's just a spontaneous change in the nucleic acid that can lead to errors in replication. And so here they're showing you thymine in its keto form, adenine in its amino form. And that's your standard base pair, T with A. But if for whatever reason, and we'll talk about some reasons that this can happen, the keto form of thymine changes to the enol form, it will no longer bind with adenine, it will instead bond with guanine. And so now you have a TG pair. instead of a TA pair. On the right, they're illustrating cytosine in the amino form, guanine in the keto form. If cytosine goes from the amino to the imino form, it will no longer bond guanine, it will bond adenine instead. So you now have a CA pair instead of a CG pair. And if the DNA proofreading machinery does not catch this, that error will be propagated through continued replication events. So in this case, it's not that DNA polymerase made a mistake and incorporated the wrong nucleic acid, but for some reason, which again we'll talk about in a little bit, the chemical structure of the nucleic acid changed just enough that it no longer binds to its appropriate partner, which has the same effect. You have a mispairing or a mismatch. Okay. You can also get direct damage to the bases. The two most common are depurination and deamination. I think depurination is worse because you completely lose a purine, you lose a nucleic acid, it's a frame shift. Deamination will lead to inappropriate base pairing. So with depurination, you lose a purine. So you lose a whole base. The base just goes away. This is usually caused by exposure to a chemical agent that damages the bonds between the bases and between the base and the backbone. So chemical exposure, anything that causes DNA damage or changes to DNA is called a mutagen. So some mutagens or some chemicals cause this to happen. They cause you to lose a whole base. So in others, you can get what they call deamination. So you basically lose this amino group. If that happens in cytosine, so if cytosine loses its amino group, it looks a lot like uracil. And so when the polymerase is coming in to add new bases and it sees this cytosine that's been deaminated, it will put in an A, right? Because uracil binds with adenine instead of the guanine that should have been there. Adenine, if it loses its amino group, it's converted to this modified base that they call hypoxanthine. Hypoxanthine, instead of A binding to T, this hypoxanthine will bind to C. So you lose, again, appropriate base pairing. And so that's what they're showing here. Normally, cytosine, right, will bind with guanine, C with G. But if you lose this amino group right here, so deamination, you lose that group, it looks a lot like uracil. Not exactly, right? Because uracil is an RNA base and cytosine is a DNA base, so you've got the wrong sugar, but the structure of the base itself looks close enough to uracil that DNA polymerase will bring in an adenine instead of bringing in the appropriate guanine. So you'll have the effect of having a point mutation. If the adenine loses its amino group, you have this modified base called hypoxanthine, and instead of having the appropriate thymine brought in, DNA polymerase brings in a cytosine instead. And again, both depurination, the loss of the purine base, or deamination are usually caused by exposure to certain classes of chemicals. That's why, like, I had lived away from California for a really long time, and apparently a lot of new laws were passed, and like every time I would come back, I would go somewhere, and it's like, Prop 65, this causes cancer. Prop 65, this causes cancer. Everything causes cancer, right? Even when you go to Starbucks. Chemicals here cause cancer. Yeah, I know. I don't care. I like coffee. It's okay. But almost any chemical could technically be, they call it a carcinogen, because it could potentially be a mutagen. So we basically surround ourselves with chemicals that cause changes to our DNA. And the state of California just wants you to be paranoid about it. You walk into a building, you know, I'm probably going to die. But if I'm drowning in coffee, I'm okay with that. But seriously, almost anything, or at least just, being alive can be a mutagen, right? Because we replicate our DNA. That can lead to mutation. Do you want to stop replicating your DNA? Probably not. So maybe we went a little overboard with that one. But going outside can also cause DNA damage. And again, just the process of being alive causes mutations and damage to your DNA. So oxidative damage, so really what we've been talking about so far are a lot of byproducts of being alive, right? You replicate DNA, you get mutations. Sometimes spontaneously you lose a base here or there. Sometimes it switches its chemical form. Sometimes spontaneously, sometimes induced. But another byproduct of being alive is that your cellular processes produce things called reactive oxygen species, which you've probably heard of, right? Mostly, some of you, maybe. Okay, well, you're hearing about them now if you haven't already. Reactive oxygen species. These cause oxidative damage to the cell. So they can be caused by normal processes. They can also be caused by exposure to high energy radiation. So basically, being alive and doing metabolism can be as damaging to your DNA as being exposed to radiation. So not only do you do it to yourself, bacteria try to do it to you as well. So infection, right, causes oxidative damage. So if you've taken microbiology, you probably remember a bacterium called Pseudomonas aeruginosa. It produces this really cool blue-green pigment. That blue-green pigment causes oxidative damage. So having an infection or normal cellular processes can lead to the production of these reactive oxygen species. We have a number of different reactive oxygen species listed here. This is not all of them, but there are some. So superoxides, hydroxyl radicals, hydrogen peroxide. And so these cause, again, direct damage to DNA and proteins. People will implicate these in aging, and then they'll try to sell you these cool products called antioxidants. You're going to be young if you just put these antioxidants. Buy this $70 lotion that has acai in it. Ooh, acai, sure. It's full of antioxidants. The idea behind these products is that antioxidants are chemicals that help you tolerate oxidative stress. Do you need to buy $70 lotion that has acai in it? No, because one, it's probably not acai, let's be real. Two, your body makes its own antioxidants. It's the same thing like, oh, go on a detox. If you have a liver and kidneys, don't go on a detox. Your liver and kidneys detox for you. You don't need to do that. You don't need to give yourself antioxidants because these are problems that your cells have evolved with for millions or hundreds of millions of years. They've also evolved ways to tolerate them or deal with them. So we have antioxidants to help us tolerate some of these stressors. Okay, any questions about how being alive is really hard on your body. I tell you what, man, like, I know you guys get real excited about spring break. I was real excited about spring break, and I'm like, oh, God, I have to come back and work for 2.5 more weeks. Because finals week is easy for me. And not for you guys. For me, it's not bad. But getting up this morning, I'm not going to lie. I turned off my alarm and went back to sleep for a little bit. 2.5 more weeks of solid class, 1 week of finals. And then we breathe for a little bit. Until August, and then we come back and do it all again. Yes?
Is there anything that's like not considered a mutagen? Because we don't label everything.
Well, we don't label everything. So not everything is a mutagen, but almost everything we have contains something that could potentially be a mutagen. So like the sign is on the thing in Starbucks, right? And the reason is, so are potato chips, same thing. The roasting process to roast coffee beans produces acrylamide. If you like potato chips and French fries, you also like acrylamide because frying potatoes releases acrylamide. Acrylamide is a mutagen. I drink a lot of coffee. I do not drink enough coffee to get enough acrylamide to be a mutagen, but potentially it could be, so they have to kind of warn you. So does that make sense? Yeah. So yeah, if you take a boatload of acrylamide and stab it in a mouse, yeah, that mouse is going to get some significant DNA damage. But unless you subsist on coffee and potatoes, you're probably going to be okay. Well, I mean, yeah, if that's all you eat, you got other problems. But you might be happy for a little while. But so your normal cellular processes lead to damage. Your normal cellular processes are why you age. You fight it as long as you can, and some people fight it longer than others. I have an aunt that's 103. Oh, but she's sassy too. She's kind of mean, I'm not gonna lie. But that's okay, she's 103, you can be mean. But that's why, you don't grow any taller, but you might notice wrinkles in the mirror. Right? Damage to your skin. Because being alive, doing normal cellular processes can lead to cellular damage, and you can't fix it all. So that's why you eventually die. We're not immortal, because we can't fix everything. But what can make things worse are things that we are exposed to from outside our bodies. So mutagens are natural or artificial agents that can induce DNA mutation. Do they always in every person? No. But can they? Is there a potential? Yes. All cells are going to be exposed to mutagens, but the type of cell and the type of exposure may change. So fungal toxins can be mutagens. So there's a fungal genera called Aspergillus. It produces a toxin called aflatoxin. Aflatoxin is the most potent natural carcinogen that exists. Low doses of aflatoxin can give you liver cancer. It's a very, very dangerous toxin. Cosmic rays, right? Everything out there is trying to kill us. UV light, the sun is trying to kill you. And these lights are trying to kill you. Industrial pollutants. Like when that oil plant went on fire in Houston, there's like this huge plume of smoke. Everything's fine. I'm like, no, it's not. Okay. Right. It's anybody seen the movie Erin Brockovich? I know I'm a little old. Erin Brockovich got Julia Roberts in it. It's a good movie. It's about how PG&E contaminated groundwater with a chemical called hexavalent chromium that gave everybody in the town cancer. So your groundwater's contaminated. Thanks, PG&E. As if they don't have enough problems already. Medical x-rays, dental x-rays, flying on a plane, going through this thing. All of it exposes you to potential mutagens. And this one's naughty. You can avoid this one. No smoking. I mean, you go to the airport, you got to go through the scanner. Sorry. I guess you can opt out, then they pat you down. That's kind of weird, so just go through the scanner. Right? You go to the dentist, they're going to give you x-rays. You break your bone, you're going to get an x-ray. You can't avoid it. Cigarette smoke, you can, and cigarette smoke is terrible. So please don't do it. Okay. So we have chemicals that can be mutagens because what happens is these chemicals almost mimic what our normal bases look like. So they are called analogs, base analogs, because they're chemicals that look a lot like a normal nucleic acid. They're not, spoiler alert. But what will happen is your cell during DNA replication, if during DNA replication it is being exposed to these base analogs, it will incorporate the base analogs instead of a normal nucleic acid. And that can lead to point mutations. These can also increase those tautomeric shifts, right? That from the keto to the enol or the amino to the imino form. So these base analogs can cause that to happen. They can make you have increased sensitivity to UV light, which is another potential mutagen. And again, they can stand in place of a normal base. And so there's this compound called 5-bromouracil that gets incorporated in the place of thymine. And what happens with this 5-bromouracil is it's really likely to do this tautomeric shift. And so sometimes it's okay if it's in the keto form, you'll get it standing in place of thymine and you'll get the adenine binding, no problem. But it is much more prone to a tautomeric shift than normal thymine. So you're just as likely to find it in the enol form, where it will lead to the incorporation of guanine instead. This is pretty much just going to be a list of everything that's trying to kill you. Okay. Alkylating agents, they donate an alkyl group to the nucleotides, and they alter base pairing affinity. So mustard gas, which is not one you hear about unless you fought in World War I. Mustard gas is a type of alkylating agent. And it again causes mismatches. There are other chemicals that it's called intercalating. So these chemicals basically get in between the bases. If you work in a molecular biology lab, if you work in my lab, I'm sorry, we have one of these. It's that one, ethidium bromide. So ethidium bromide is an intercalating agent. It wedges in between the base pairs of DNA and causes DNA unwinding and base pair distortion. So this causes significant damage directly to DNA. Now, if you work with ethidium bromide, don't be scared. There's about as much in an agarose gel, like there's as much carcinogen in an agarose gel as there is in a cigarette. So if you smoke and you're going to complain about ethidium bromide, I have no sympathy for you. Otherwise, wear gloves. Right? Don't touch things without gloves. And we will pick up on Wednesday with adduct-forming agents. You should be able to go in to